Hey guys, it's Kevin. Welcome to our first video on the book of Job. We are starting this off in Sunday school class, and we have completed one lesson. We're going to be doing this all summer, so I want to give you a quick recap on our very first lesson. So I showed a video, and I'll include a link down below of how you can watch the video. Just a big overview of the entire book of Job. It's about 7 minutes long. Really good to check that out just to get a good idea of what this book is about. But what we're going to be doing all summer is doing a verse-by-verse study on this. And so what we're going to do for our very first lesson is do a quick study on verse 1. So verse 1 says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil." So this is the very first verse of the entire book. It's some 42 chapters long, and so this is a long book. And the very first couple of chapters kind of set up the characters, they set up the background, the story, and then we really get into the meat of it later. But I want to start off with verse 1, and I've got the word "was" underlined here because that's what I want to talk about today. Let's kind of get some context about this book. So let's go ahead and bring in our slide. All right, here I am. So let's go ahead and start about looking at the word "was." When was, and we want to talk about three things. Number one, when did Job live? So what time frame was Job alive? Then secondly, when was this book written? So this will be two different times, of course, but when was the book written to the best of our knowledge? And then who wrote the book? So I want to answer those three questions today. It's just a really basic introductory lesson to this book. But let's go ahead and talk about when did Job live. So it's really kind of tricky to figure out when Job was alive. If we're going to take Job as a literal historical person, which we do, it is really hard to figure out when he was on the earth because he doesn't mention a lot of things that give us any indication of what was going on in his culture. For example, he never mentions the temple or the tabernacles or priest or the law in general. And so we are led to believe that Job probably lived before the giving of the law from Moses. And so there's a couple verses that you can turn to if you want to, but Job 42 verse 15 is one example. He talks about giving an inheritance to his daughters and his sons. And giving an inheritance to your daughters, that was something that wasn't in the law. The law, when Moses gave it, said that the inheritance that you give is only going to go to the sons. And so if we see Job as an upright man and he's doing everything faithfully to God, then he wouldn't be violating the law, or at least we don't think he would be. And so when it says that he gives his inheritance to his daughters as well, we're assuming that the law hasn't been given and that he's in that pre-law time period. Also in Job 1:5, it talks about Job making sacrifices, burnt sacrifices to the Lord, and he does it on his own, and he doesn't go through a priest. And again, that's something that's mentioned in the law. So it seems to be that in the book of Job, Job is living in a time period before the law was actually given. If that's the case, then that's going to make Job a contemporary of Abraham, Lot, and Isaac, and that's roughly 2200 BC. This is just a guess. They're not mentioned in the book of Job, these patriarchs, but sometimes you'll see that Job is mentioned to be in the patriarchal period, and that's, these are the big patriarchs, the fathers of our faith. So 2200 BC is an idea of when he lived. Another indication that we have that this was before, or this was early, before the law, is that Job lived to be pretty old. He lived to be some 200 years old. There is a is it the Septuagint? I think the Septuagint says that Job lived to be 240 years old. That's not in our canon of Scripture, but that is an extra biblical source. But certainly lived to be over 200. If you look at Job 42, this is towards the end of the book. It says that he lived 140 years after these things. And so what things are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the very beginning where he lived and he had 10 children. And the 10 children were old enough to have a life of their own and homes of their own. And then he lost everything. He lost his children and his health and his money and possessions, stuff like that. But then the Lord blessed him again and he had 10 more children and they grew up. And so we're seeing that a lot of stuff happened between chapters 1 and chapter 42. And then chapter 42 says after all of this stuff happened, Job lived another 140 years. So he probably did live over 200 years, which is a pretty old time to live. And this was definitely puts him a lot later, a lot earlier, before the law, where people are living to be a lot older. Once we get to like the book of the Judges, you see that the life expectancy goes down pretty significantly. And so all of these three things would tell us to believe that Job lived probably in the patriarchal period, probably around Abraham that time, or maybe shortly thereafter. Now, when was the book written? So this is talking about when Job was alive, but when was the book written? So it possibly is one of the oldest books in the Bible as far as when it was recorded. It probably was not written before the Pentateuch, but it's really hard to say. We don't have a lot of clear indications of when it was written. It was written in Hebrew, but the Hebrew is very unlike the rest of the Hebrew in the Old Testament. And there's a lot of quotations in Aramaic, which will lead some scholars to say, well, if it's got Aramaic in it, it must be really a younger book. Maybe it was one of the last books written in the Old Testament, like almost before Jesus got here. And then other people will say, no, the Aramaic tells us that it's probably even older than we thought. Maybe it's the first book written of the Bible. And so we have these language issues of Hebrew and Aramaic that kind of trip scholars up as to figure out when this book was written. D.A. Carson, he would not pin a date down, but he says, look, we got two different limits here. He thinks that the oldest limit is the 800 BC date, and the 200 BC would be your youngest date. And the reason he says that is because we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls were dated around 200 BC, and the Book of Job was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you would not have the Book of Job written after 200 BC. That would be like your limit for the newest it could be. Probably wasn't written that recently. It's probably a lot older than that. But D.A. Carson says between 800 and 200 BC. Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, which is most scholars are pretty confident that was written around 600 BC. Well, Ezekiel mentions Job, not necessarily a quote from the book of Job, but he does mention the character, the name of Job. And so that kind of leads you to the idea that maybe the book of Job is older than 600 BC. And then you have some scholars as well say that maybe this is even before the Exodus, which would lead probably to like an author being like Moses. But the Exodus was around the 1300s BC. There's a little bit of debate on that. But there would be this is when most scholars would say it would be the extreme limit as far as how old this book was written. So we don't really know when it was written. There's some ideas. We know it's an old book. It could be the oldest book in the Old Testament or the entire Bible. But these are some ideas of when it was written. And then finally, who wrote the book? Who wrote this book? Well, we don't know who wrote it. No one knows for sure who wrote the book. Job is not likely to be the author because his death is mentioned in the end of the book, and so it's pretty hard to write a book about yourself if you are including the death as well. And so Job is not likely the author. And then the Talmud in Jewish historical records, they suggest that Moses is the author, but I would take that with a grain of salt because it kind of flip-flops on who the author is there. But Moses has been suggested by some to be the author. Again, you go back to that pre-Exodus time when Moses was leading the people out of Egypt, that he could have been the author. And then another idea is that there's possibly multiple authors. It's kind of like a conglomerate of different people writing it, kind of like the book of Psalms is multiple authors all coming together, and you have one book of Psalms. And so some people, I'm not saying this is necessarily what we believe, but some people think that there are multiple authors in the book of Job, that maybe some people wrote the first part of it and then other people wrote the last part of it. That's up for debate. The bottom line is we don't know who exactly wrote the book of Job or when it was written. We just know it's a very old book, and he probably lived during the patriarchal times in the Old Testament. But that's all I got for today. This is just a really big introduction to the book of Job. We'll dig deeper into the verse 5 verse study next week. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again for the next video next Sunday.